What I'm going to talk about today is musical theater. And I have some examples to show you, but we might have to wait till next time to see some of the examples. So let me raise the curtain. Excellent. Okay. Musical theater. Musical theater is several things. One, it's referred to as popular theater. Why is musical theater popular theater? Anybody? Well, yes. Why?
People like music?
Yeah. I mean, musical theater tends to be very popular and has been throughout the centuries. Because most musical theater is entertainment that was created for the masses. It was created for the average person. It's a little different than opera. Opera especially the Italian opera, is all sung. Everything in it is sung. They don't speak. And they tell a story through song. Opera tends to be hard to understand for a lot of people. And therefore, especially in these days and times, it's considered elitist. Opera was created in France for the court, for the king and the court. And pretty much since its first creations has remained that, kind of for the upper class. Theater, on the hand, musical theater, through most of its life, has been for the general population. It's easy to understand, and for the most part, it's fun. Therefore, it's popular theater. It's also what we refer to as presentational. Presentational. By being presentational, what we're saying is, and sometimes you'll hear this referred to as theatrical. In realistic theater, or in forms of melodrama, we've talked about heroic drama. In those types of forms, in serious drama, if two actors are talking to each other, they pretend that the audience isn't there. In other words, you're looking into their life. They create a world up on the stage, and they let you watch that world. You see understand what I'm saying? In musical theater, they break that convention. They play to the audience. In other words, we're putting on a presentation. And it's theatrical because we let the audience know they're out of play. We don't want you to think this is a real world. We want you involved in it. And audience involvement becomes a big part of musical theater because it is presentational, because it is theatrical. In musical theater, they do strange things and get away with it, and audiences are okay with it because it is musical theater. For example, in real life, if you were at a cafe, if you were down here at Starbucks having a cup of coffee, and you're talking with your buddies, and all of a sudden the people at the table next to you just start jumping up on the chairs and singing and dancing. and start dancing across all the tables, what would happen to them? Security! Their butts would be arrested. They'd be locked up. In the world of musical theater, though, it's okay. In fact, you join in. So you'd become the chorus. And you'd sing along with them and dance. That's the world of musical theater. It's played to the audience, and the audience is in on it. When they finish a number in musical theater, what do? They wait for applause. They'll turn and look for it. They'll freeze because they want the audience to applaud between each number. In drama, in realistic drama, you don't do that. In fact, I've been to plays on Broadway. I feel fortunate. I got to see Robert Duvall act on Broadway. I've also seen some other pretty really good actors. But I'll never forget Robert Duvall was acting on Broadway in a play called American Buffalo, where he plays this small-town crook who runs a pawn shop, and he's trying to steal a buffalo nickel. That's why it's American Buffalo. And it's a rare buffalo nickel, and he hires a crook to go into this place and steal it for him. And when Robert Duvall walked out, and he was this small-town hood, and he walked out, and the audience started applauding, he had to stop. And you could almost see he was getting pissed off because they were holding him up. Because he was in the moment. He wanted to get to acting. He didn't like the applause at the beginning of the show. But in musical theater, they want it. They want it. That's just part of it. Because it is theatrical. We're at a play. We know it. We don't pretend we're not. And we're presenting it to the audience, knowing the audience is there. So it's played out. It's played to the audience. Does that make sense? So it's popular, it's presentational, and also, in that way, theatrical. What we're going to do is I'm going to take you on a history of musical theater. And what has happened is musical theater is relatively new as we know it. But it grew out of some other things that were not musical theater as we know it now. And we're going to go back and look at those other things and see how musical theater got to be what it is today. Okay? And the first thing that I want to go back and look at is called Ballad Opera. Ballad Opera. Ballad opera was very popular in the 1700s. It is not true opera. It's not Italian opera. In fact, it makes fun of Italian opera. In ballad opera, there is dialogue. People do talk. And then they sing songs. Ballad opera actually has a lot of songs in each show. And I'll explain that a little bit more. The way they came up with ballad operas, the way they first created them, is if I were going to write one, I would have gone back to the songs that were sung in taverns in that day and time. People needed a place to go hang out. Where would they go hang out? They'd go down to the local tavern. They'd hang out at the tavern. They would drink. They would talk. They would play games. And they would sing. And sing-alongs were really, really popular. And so what would happen was, if I wanted to create a ballad opera, I would create a story. And then I would take all the top 40 hits of the time, the stuff that everybody sang at the taverns, and I'd stick them into the show, whether they belonged there or not. So if we were doing it today, if we wrote a ballad opera today, and say we wanted to write a story about a young girl meeting a young man, are there any popular songs out there about love?
Yeah.
Huh? What? Give me a title. Oh, don't clam up. I'm not going to have you sing it. Give me a title. What's a top 40 song about love? Huh? You guys listen to music. I know you do. What's the top 40 song about love? About relationship? YMCA. That's, yeah, we could do an older version. What's a popular song now about love? Huh? You got your computer open. What's a popular song about love? YouTube it.
Anything by Taylor Swift.
Taylor Swift. There we go. Taylor Swift does a lot of pop ballads. A lot of them have to do with love or love that didn't work out or whatever it might be. Love that didn't work out. A lot of her stuff's about that, right? So, okay. Oh, gee, the couple breaks up. Put in a Taylor Swift song. I mean, that's how they would write it. And then they go, well, gee, the guy, he got bad and he joined a street gang. Can we find a song about breaking the law or gangs? Huh?
Hey, look at me.
Because you're laughing at me. Are there any songs about that?
You can put in some NWA, F Police.
Huh?
You can put in NWA, F Police.
F Police? Yeah. Somebody said something.
Pretty much anything rap.
Well, not anything.
The theme for the show comes.
Bad boys, what we gonna do, what we gonna do. Well, everybody knows that. It would fit. Ah, yeah, his dad's a cop, and he arrests him. Put that song in. See where I'm going with this? You take songs that anybody would know, stick them into the show. As you tell the story, they would just stop acting and then sing that song. And guess what the audience would do? Sing with them. It was a big sing-along. People would come to the show, and as it was going along, they just sing along. And they had a good old time. And that's what the ballad operas were. They did tell a story. There was some kind of story that they told. The songs usually were not original. They might write something for them, but that was rare. Usually they just took popular tunes of the time period, stick them into the show, and then just let everybody sing along. And they had a good time. See why it's popular theater? It's popular theater. The average person, anybody, would know the songs that they were performing. Okay? One of the most popular pieces, in fact, this sounds like a good test question, the single most popular theatrical work of the 18th century. The single most popular theatrical work of the 18th century. That's for 100 years, folks. Came out in 1728, and it was John Gay's The Beggars Opera. John Gay wrote the Beggars Opera. It was the single most popular theatrical work of the 18th century. It made fun of Italian operas. At the same time, it did tell a story. It's kind of a crazy story, but it does have a story to it. In the Beggars Opera, and I'm not going to ask you the names of these characters, just to give you an idea of what the story is. There's a guy named McHeath, and McHeath is a highwayman. What's a highwayman? Does anyone here know?
He waits on roads and robs people.
Yeah, he goes out on roads and he robs people. He's a highwayman. He's also a rogue. Not like the X-Men rogue, but he's a rogue. In other words, he goes out on his own, and he's kind of a bad boy. Well, he's not kind of. This guy is a bad boy. He's a real bad boy. He's also very good looking. And McHeath starts to have an affair with a lady named Polly. And Polly is the daughter of a local sheriff who's crooked. A crooked sheriff. And what this guy does, his name's Peachum, the father, he catches thieves, and then he also takes stuff from thieves and sells it. So he's kind of a bad guy. Well, anyway, what happens is McHeath and Polly get secretly married to one another. And when the dad hears about this, he's pretty angry. And he decides that what he really needs to do is kill McHeath, or have him killed. And in doing so, he could collect a reward and get rid of his son-in-law. And he thinks this is a pretty good idea. Well, McHeath hears about it, escapes from being killed, goes to a local tavern where there are a lot of prostitutes hanging out. And he starts talking with the prostitutes and realizes that he likes several of them. He's a bad boy. They get him drunk, and then two of them turn him in for the money. They get a reward for turning him in. He gets arrested. He goes to jail. When he gets to jail, he falls in love, or pretends to fall in love, with Lucy, the warden's daughter. He gets Lucy to agree to break him out and says he'll marry her. When Polly shows up. Polly says, I'm already married to him. They have a girl fight. He tells Lucy that Polly's crazy, don't listen to her. She helps him to escape. He escapes. Then he gets caught again. This time they're going to hang him. It's the end of the story. And Polly and Lucy show up and beg for him to be saved. And then the audience gets to vote on it. And they decide to have a happy ending. And he goes off in the end with Polly, his first wife. That's the story. It's a crazy story. This play still gets done, though. It still gets performed. What's wild about it? It contains 69 songs. Now, on Broadway today, how many songs might a Broadway show have?
5.
More than 5. Not many more than 5.
10.
About 10 or 12. And they reprise them. They sing them over and over again. This had 69 songs in it. So along the way of this very loose story, they just stop and sing every so often, a whole lot. And the audience would sing along. This show would go on for 3-4 hours. I mean, if you have 69 songs and each song's 3 or 4 minutes long, without the dialogue, it's a long night in the theater. Okay? But they loved it. It was a hit. It was the hit of its time period. And it set the standard for all the ballad operas that followed. Everybody copied it. John Gay's Beggars Opera, because there were others written. But they used it as the poster child for all beggars, for all of the ballad operas. Any questions about that? I have an example of the show, and next class I'm going to show it to you. Okay. No questions? All right. So one of the influences of modern musical theater is ballad opera. I'm going to jump time a little bit. We're going to go into the 1800s. And I'm going to talk about 3 other influences to the modern musical. In the United States, these 3 forms of entertainment are going to have huge impacts on musical theater as we now know it. One of the earliest of these is the Minstrel Show. The Minstrel Show was very popular throughout the United States during the early part of the 20th century and throughout the 19th century. A minstrel show is a crude, low-grade style of song, dance, and comic entertainment. Low-grade style of song, dance, and comic entertainment. It's a stereotyped view of plantation life. A stereotyped view of plantation life.
I'm sorry, you said a low grade style of song, dance, and what else?
Comic entertainment. I'm not fond at all of the minstrel show, but I have to talk about it because it does have a huge impact on musical theater. It's a stereotyped view of plantation life. In the beginning, it was performed by white actors wearing black face and a very stylized black face. Basically, it was a variety show. There were 3 acts. Act 1 would be a bunch of different comedians, singers, and dancers. And then it would end with the entire company coming out doing a musical number together. Act 2 was called the Fantasia. the Fantasia. The Fantasia consisted of specialty acts. Specialty acts might include strongmen. Somebody would come out and lift weights or lift heavy things. Knife throwers. Female impersonators. It could be all kinds of things. And then finally, the third act would be a burlesque of a recent event. In other words, they'd make fun of something that was in the news, something that people knew about that had just happened. These companies traveled. They toured around the United States. And what would happen is whenever they got to a new place, they would get a newspaper and find out the local news. What has recently happened in this town? And then they would write this satire, this comic piece about that event. And that way the locals would relate to it. They would know what had happened. For example, in my research, I came across, they went into a town and there was a local politician that they were making fun of. And so what they did is they took the story of Macbeth and told the story of this local politician who had gone bad. And they made him the Macbeth character. But instead of calling it Macbeth, they called the story Bad Breath. And then the locals all laughed about making fun of this local politician who had gone bad. There are several famous performers and writers who come out of the minstrel shows. One is a gentleman named Edwin Christie. Edwin Christie was a performer, and he had a company called the Christie Minstrels. And he became a huge star. Wherever he went, he had a big following. The Christie Minstrels would later that name would be used for a folk rock band called the New Christie Minstrels, which were real popular in the 1960s and 70s. But the Christie Minstrels was the name of his company. More important is a guy by the name of Stephen Foster. Maybe you've heard of him. Stephen Foster lived from 1826 to 1864. He's probably the most famous composer of the minstrel theater. And he becomes one of the greatest composers, American composers, of the 19th century. He wrote a lot of songs. Some of them you've probably heard. Way down upon the Swanee River, far, far away. That's one of his. The Camptown races 5 miles long, doo-da, doo-da. That's one of his. One of the state songs of the state of Kentucky, My Old Kentucky Home, is one of his. And oh, Susanna, don't you cry for me. I'm gone from Alabama with a banjo on my knee. That's another one of his songs. He wrote a lot more. What's funny about him, he's writing stories about life in the Old South, the Deep South, about plantation life, this guy never was any further south than Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He had no idea what life in the South was like. And yet, he wrote all these songs that were used in these stories that were sung all over the world and are still being sung by school children everywhere. And he was never there. Had no idea what it was like. After the American Civil War, a lot of African American performers get involved in not in vaudeville, but also in the minstrel shows. And the most famous of the African American performers was a gentleman by the name of James A. Bland. James A. Bland was a performer and a composer. He was educated in the North. He was extremely well educated. Probably his most famous song was Carry Me Back to Old Virginia, which is one of the state songs of the state of Virginia. Carry me back to old Virginia. What's amazing about him is he wrote over 600 songs during his lifetime. That's a lot. A number of these songs are still survive and are protected in the Library of Congress today. Okay. Any questions or thoughts about the vaudeville about the minstrel shows? Like I said, I'm not a big fan of the minstrel shows. We just have to talk about them because some of these composers especially are huge in American theater and American music. Okay, vaudeville. Vaudeville. Now we'll get into something I like to talk about. Vaudeville is a collection of variety acts, sketches, and short plays, variety acts, sketches, and short plays put together into an evening's entertainment. Variety acts, sketches, and short plays put together into an evening's entertainment. The first vaudeville performance, and we can actually say there was a first, was in 1866. And it was a production which they gave the name The Black Crook. The Black Crook, 1866. The Black Crook, there's an interesting story about it. New York City, it's going to sound like a bad joke. There was a bar in New York City. In the bar were two out-of-work actors. And they're sitting around trying to figure out how they're going to make money. And they're talking over different ideas. And into the bar walks some young women who were ballet dancers, out of work ballet dancers. They had been members of a company that had just gone bankrupt. And all of a sudden they found themselves in New York, no jobs. They didn't know what they were going to do. So the actors sit down with the ballet dancers and they say, let's create a show. They got together. They got this idea for the Black Crook. And they put together this variety show that features the talents of actors, singers, and 100 dancers. 100 ballet dancers. It was a hit. People went crazy over this thing. Again, it's 1866. And all of a sudden, women come out wearing outfits that show their legs. Oh! Scandal. This is a time period, 1866, when women wore dresses with hoops underneath that went to the ground. If you showed your ankles, you were a hussy. You were bad, B-A-D. No one would have anything to do with you. And these girls came out on stage showing their whole leg. Oh, mercy. Oh my God. Dancing girls showing their legs. The lines went around the block to get into the theater. You could not get tickets to get in there. I mean, people were lined up forever to get in to see that play. It was huge. It had big cast, big production numbers, and it was just an incredible hit. It ran for 16 months at New York's Niblo Garden Theater. 16 months was unheard of. This is a time when actor managers are going in doing a show one night or maybe a week. This thing ran for 16 months. 8 shows a week. It grossed over $1 million. That was unheard of. I mean, that would be like billions today. At a time when there was not a lot of money after the Civil War. People could not get enough of it. And what that did was it started a trend. The idea that was put into the black crook of these variety shows, dancers, singers, and actors all working together. Vaudeville companies sprung up everywhere and started touring the United States. And it was very, very, very popular. People loved vaudeville. Okay. If you went to see a vaudeville show, it would basically go like this. The play would begin, or the evening would begin with a master of ceremonies who was called the monologuist. The monologuist. The monologuist would come out and they told jokes, or he told jokes, and then he would spend the evening introducing all the other acts. So he's the master of ceremonies. He would control the evening. It would be his show. That would be followed by a first act, and the first act would consist of dance numbers, songs, different comedians, and sometimes whole musical numbers where a lot of people would come out and perform together. So it would be individual acts as well as group acts. The second part of a vaudeville, similar to the minstrel shows, but they called them surefire acts. Part 2, surefire acts. Surefire. Surefire acts were specialty acts. Wrestlers, strongmen, jugglers, knife throwers. And one of the most famous, probably the most famous surefire act ever, this was in the 1890s, was a little lady called Little Egypt. Little Egypt was one of the highest paid performers of that time period. Little Egypt was a dancer. What kind of dance do you think she did? I think you're right, I didn't hear it. She's a belly dancer. Again, in a time period when women wore dresses that covered everything. Remember, the Victorian period, Queen Victoria of England kind of ruled fashion. And she believed in being covered from here to the floor. Maybe the hands could stick out. That was about it. And out comes Little Egypt. She was not just revealing legs. Her belly was sticking out. Oh my goodness. When Little Egypt performed, these are pictures of Little Egypt. When Little Egypt performed, if people knew she was going to be there, the house was packed. People would spend huge money to see a belly dancer. Except they didn't call it belly dance in that time period. They called it Hoochie Coochie dancing. She was a Hoochie Coochie dancer. I'll write it for you. She was a Hoochie Coochie dancer. H-O-O-T-C-H-Y. Hoochie. K-O-O-T-C-H-Y. Coochie. For that time period, just it blew people away. And so she was paid huge money. And this triggered other Hoochie Coochie dancers. In fact, as late as the 1970s, early 70s, you could go to county fairs, and back at the back of the park, they would have the Hoochie Coochie dancer show, where girls would come out and dance. And in some county fairs, that was real hot stuff. And they were referred to as the Hoochie Coochie dancers. But they got it from Little Egypt. Little Egypt. Any questions about Little Egypt? There was a part 3 to the vaudeville, and it was called the grand finale. The grand finale was a big production number. And quite often, it was a patriotic display of some kind, where the whole cast would come out and they would sing a medley of very patriotic songs and sing and dance to them. And of course, if they came out and it was patriotic enough, the audience would get all worked up, and they were guaranteed a standing ovation at the end, because people would get really worked up singing along with them and enjoying their patriotic numbers. there were a lot of people who later became film stars who performed in the vaudevilles. And these vaudevilles, the sets were simple. Once, the one that was on Broadway at the Niblo Theater, the Black Crook, had pretty big scenery because it didn't move. But most of the vaudeville companies toured, they traveled. So the scenery was very simple. A lot of times they would just use backdrop, bye, bye, see ya, aloha. They would have backdrops that would drop in with different scenes painted on them, and then the people would just come out and perform in front of them. They didn't do much more than that. Very simple sets. They did have a lot of costume changes, and they would come out in costumes. Again, the actors supplied their own costumes. It wasn't something that anyone built for them. It was supplied by the company themselves. But a lot of big stars came out of this. I showed you when we were talking about comedy, Abbott and Costello. They started in vaudeville. I showed you the Marx Brothers. The Marx Brothers started in vaudeville. The Three Stooges, W.C. Fields, and many, many, many more got their start on the vaudeville stage. I've read a lot of different biographies of some of these people, and Groucho Marx tells a very, very funny story about what life was like on the vaudeville stage and what it was like when he traveled with his brothers. And this one story he was talking about, they were performing, and I forgot the name of the city, but they were performing in one of the cities, and in the company that the Marx Brothers were in was also W.C. Fields. Oh yes, my little chickadee, if you've ever seen him perform. And also in that company was Bert Lahr. Does anybody here know who Bert Lahr was? You've seen him perform, I know you have. He was in a lot of movies. Probably the one you know him as is the Cowardly Lion in The Wizard of Oz. That's Bert Lahr. And Bert Lahr, according to Groucho, liked to pull tricks. He loved to pull jokes on people. And in his act, W.C. Fields came out with a special pool table. And one of his things he did was he would do tricks on the pool table. He'd make the cue ball jump, do all kinds of crazy tricks. He was a great pool player. And he had a pool cue. In one of his movies, he actually did this. He had a pool cue that was curved. And he would hit the ball over here by aiming this way. And it would curve back, and he'd hit the ball and sink a shot. But he was doing all these tricks with his, and then he would tell jokes as he would do his act. And he didn't know it, but Bert Lahr crawled out from under a curtain and got up under the pool table. And the pool table had a little decoration around the bottom, a little curtain to make it look fancy. And Bert Lahr was under the pool table, and he would open up the curtain and go and make faces at the audience right before W.C. Fields would get to the punchline of his joke. So the audience was laughing. And the jokes didn't work because they had already laughed before he could get to the punchline. And W.C. Fields couldn't figure out what was going on. He's running around, oh yes, we're now going to do a shot in the left corner. And wah! And the audience would laugh. Oh yes, and he's playing pool and he's trying to do his act. And all of a sudden he saw this bald head come out from under the table and back in. W.C. Fields kept just kind of talking and walking around. And finally that head came out and a pool cue comes down on top of him. And he knocked him out. And he just spread eagle on the floor. And the audience thought it was part of the act. They're, ah, that's funny. And he said, he almost killed him. And he said, the thing with W.C. Fields is you didn't upstage him, or you would have hell to pay. But that was typical, these companies, these very talented people traveling together around the country and performing. They would also do what are called burlesque. Burlesque gets started in the 1880s. Burlesque is much like vaudeville, a collection of variety acts mingled with musical numbers. The only thing different with burlesque is it's more adult entertainment. There would be more scantily clad ladies, and the jokes would not always be for families. The comedians told dirtier jokes. The skits were more adult. The women would wear really wild costumes. Later on, by the 1900s, burlesque would change. It would evolve into something else. Striptease shows. But when it first started, it was just more adult entertainment done with the vaudeville. In fact, what the vaudeville companies would do, when they would come into a city, early in the evening, they would do the vaudeville. Then the audience would go home, and then late that night, the same company would do a burlesque. So the same performers would come out, and they would just change the jokes, make it more for adults. And they also did something else, which I didn't know about for a long time, but when I discovered it, I think it's really cool. They would do what was called a Toby show. T-O-B-E-Y, Toby, a Toby show. Toby shows were for kids. The lead character, the monologuist in the Toby show, was always Toby. And Toby was a country bumpkin. He would have a red wig, he would have straw hat, and he would wear bib overalls, and he would look like he was from the country. And he would tell really countrified jokes. They would take stories, fairy tales, or bedtime stories for kids, and it would be loosely told. They would tell that story while sticking in variety acts, comics, dancers. So it would be a vaudeville for kids that loosely told a story. For example, there's a script out there now that I've actually directed, and it's a Toby show. And what the Toby show is about is they take the story of Cinderella, and it takes place as though it were modern times. Of course, it's like 1920. And in the story, there's a prince who's actually an aviator in this story, who crashes on a farm where Cindy Lou lives instead of Cinderella, with her evil stepsisters and her stepmom. And Toby not only narrates the story, but he helps her have a happy ending. It's just a Cinderella story. But right in the middle of it, they'll be in the middle of acting, and all of a sudden, Toby will start telling jokes. And they'll do jokes. And then you're right in the middle of the story, and then some dancers come out and do a dance. So it was a variety show, but they work it out where they're all farm characters. That's, the hired hands come out and do a song and dance number. They just work that into the show. So when these companies came to your town, you could see a Toby show early in the morning, school kids, vaudeville for the family, and then the dads would come back, see the burlesque later that night. Vaudeville, burlesque, extremely popular throughout the 1800s, on into the 1900s. And then it dies. And it dies around 1930. What do you think killed it? Movies, talkies. They'd had, when it was silent movies, it didn't seem to bother the vaudevilles because the vaudevilles were, you know, speaking and talking. But when they came out with talking movies in the 1930s, that was a whole new thing, and everybody wanted to go to the new technology. And the new technology was talking film, not people live on stage telling jokes. And so everybody wanted to go see films. And where did the stars from vaudeville go? To films. And then later television. So a lot of the people who were stars in this period would later then become film stars. Okay. And with that, I'm going to stop. Next time, I'm going to talk about the reviews. Reviews, musical reviews. Okay, you're good.